episode 9 of the Snare Drum Virtuoso podcast. My name is Jonathan Curtis, and today I'm going to be asking the question, what does it mean for something to be rudimental? And this is going to be something more of an exploration rather than a specific answer, because I think this is actually quite a difficult question. And this is something I have been wrestling with recently because I have a forthcoming publication called The Rudimental Drummer, which is dedicated to rudimental drumming in all its forms. It covers the history, vocabulary, concepts, techniques, and the repertoire of the rudimental tradition. And I have had some really interesting discussions with people who have looked at various drafts of this and the pieces I have composed for it. And we've really discussed the nature of what something means to be rudimental. So that's going to be the basis for today's, I'll call it an exploration, because I'm not convinced I actually have a dedicated answer to that question. Now, before we begin, we're going to listen to a piece by the composer William Shinstein. This is a composer I have only relatively recently discovered, actually through the course of researching this book, and someone whose work is really interesting because he broke with traditions in a number of ways. He's one of the only rudimental composers I have found, and this is a topic I'm going to be talking about, right? What defines a rudimental composer? But he is one of the only traditional rudimental composers I have found who actively worked with buzz rolls. Buzz rolls are very rare in the rudimental tradition, and he is someone that really fought back against this and basically said, why should they be rare? They're a perfectly valid technique and we should make use of them. So a lot of his work features buzz rolls when many of his contemporaries don't. Now, this piece is going to be from a book called Adventures in Solo Drumming. And this is a book that's actually a dedication to lots of his contemporaries. And he dedicates each piece to a specific drummer and composes in that drummer's style. So this piece is dedicated to William F. Ludwig, and it is entitled Father and Son. So before we go any further, let us enjoy Father and Son from Adventures in Solo Drumming by William Shinstein. There we have it, Father and Son by William Shinstein. So let's dive right in and start tackling this difficult question. I'm going to start by making a distinction between two different ideas that the word rudimental references. And this is, as I say, something I have been wrestling with over the course of writing this book. I'm going to define rudimental in two different ways, or let me rephrase that. I'm going to suggest two different definitions of the word rudimental, and then we can apply this to different ideas and contexts and see if they bear out. The first idea, or the first definition of the word rudimental, is in regards to a specific style of music. In this sense, the word rudimental references a style, a genre, a subset of drumming, and the tradition that goes along with that. So we can say that we can compose in a rudimental style, and it has recognizable characteristics, it has recognizable ways of playing, recognizable techniques, recognizable characters. You know, somebody like John Pratt is an archetypal rudimental drummer, an archetypal rudimental composer, and his pieces are archetypal rudimental pieces. Now, without getting into the specifics of what that means just yet, this is in reference to a style of music in the same way that we might say a piece of music is a blues or is jazz. It contains certain characteristics, a certain style that is recognizable, and we are able to point to it and go, yes, that is rudimental. So the first sense that we can use the term is as describing a specific style of music, and this kind of contains the history and the culture and the tradition that goes with that. And I will return to this a little later on, but for now let's address the second point here, the second definition. And this one's a little bit more difficult to define and a little bit murky. And this is an idea that I've been playing with as I've written The Rudimental Drummer. And it is the idea that rudimental drumming is not a specific style of drumming. It is not a specific way of playing the drums. It doesn't refer to a specific subset of players or techniques or vocabulary. It is just a descriptive overview of how we play the drums, period. I say in the start of The Rudimental Drummer, the history of rudimental drumming is the history of snare drumming. And by extension, the history of the drum kit, because of course the snare drum came first and then the trap kit was developed around that later on. And this is the idea that rudimental drumming as an idea, as a concept, is actually describing the entirety of playing a drum. It covers everything that comprises how we play a drum at all, regardless of style, technique, context, tradition, or anything else. It is not a style of music, it is not a technique, it is how we play the drums, period. And this becomes a lot more far-reaching because this doesn't necessarily align with some people's ideas of what rudimental drumming is and how we should use that word. But I'm going to try to expand and unpack this a little bit. The reason I think this, and the reason I argue for this in the book, is because rudimental drumming and the rudiments themselves are concepts. They are broader approaches to rhythm. They are broader approaches to technique. And ultimately, they are broader approaches to how we hit a drum with a stick, or more specifically, with a pair of drumsticks. We have the categorized set of rudiments that include all the named patterns, single strokes, double strokes, flammacues, paradiddles, paradiddle-diddles, and so forth, and all of the different traditions that contributed to this, the flammed mill from Switzerland, and all of the measured rolls and the buzz strokes, and all of this. These are the rudiments, right? These are the list of 40 standard rudiments that we have today in the American tradition, and the French rudiments and the Swiss rudiments, and all of the wonderful ways that have been documented and published on over the years. However, when you look at the development of these, even if you take something like the humble paradiddle and you start placing it in a larger concept, it becomes much bigger, it becomes much broader, and it becomes much more murky when we try to define the borders of that. Now, paradiddles are functional. They developed because they served a purpose. I believe, and this is my hypothesis, I believe that paradiddles developed during marching to allow the accent that plays on a march to fall on the same hand as the foot that the drummer is currently marching on. So when you're on the road, you're marching right, left. If you're wanting to accent on the drum at the same time as that, if you do that with paradiddles instead of single strokes, the hand that plays the accent is always going to line up with the foot that's marching, because you can play paradiddle, 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 and the hand that is playing the accent alternates, and you can align this with each step you take. Whether or not that's true, it demonstrates a functional approach to that pattern. It's part of the development of where a paradiddle comes from and how it was used. It developed because it served a purpose. It developed because it served some particular function. But beyond this, a paradiddle has developed into a much broader concept. A paradiddle is essentially a combination of single strokes and double strokes. Phonetically, pa and ra refer to single strokes, one stroke on each hand, and the word diddle refers to a set of double strokes on the same hand, two strokes on the same hand. Generally speaking, a diddle refers to a single instance of a double stroke, while double strokes generally refer to a sustained double stroke roll. This is not always the case, but nevertheless, the word diddle is used to describe a double stroke, two strokes on the same hand. So when we have the term pa, ra, diddle, It is telling us two things. It is onomatopoeic in that it kind of sounds like what it plays, paradiddle, 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 and it is also expressing how we play it. It doesn't need to make recourse to right hands or left hands. We can hear that built in, paradiddle, paradiddle, paradiddle. We're doing two single strokes, and then we're doing a double stroke afterwards. So then we might ask, well, what happens if we play paradiddle diddle? We simply stick another diddle on the end, which extends the sticking. Pa, ra, two single strokes, diddle, double stroke, diddle, double stroke again. Pa, ra, diddle, diddle. Well, this was apparently common enough that we've given it a distinct name, and we've set it within our list of standard rudiments. Likewise for the double paradiddle, which is often called a para-paradiddle, for obvious reasons now. We have two sets of singles per hand, pa, ra, and then the diddle. Triple paradiddle, para-para-paradiddle. It sounds the way it plays and it describes the hands we use to play it. But now, what about one that's not on the list? What about a para-para-diddle-diddle? Well, within the terminology, within the concept of the paradiddle, this is perfectly valid. So anybody would understand that a para-para-diddle-diddle is a set of sticking with two sets of single strokes on a hand, pa-ra, and then two sets of double strokes, diddle, diddle. This is completely valid, and this is found within a lot of the repertoire, and this is found within a lot of the pedagogical approaches as well. This is something Bob Becker talks about a lot in his treatment of paradiddles in Rudimental Arithmetic, which was published in 2008. So there's definitely precedent for this type of analysis where we view the paradiddles, we view the rudiments themselves as much broader concepts that describe. And this is really the important point here. They don't prescribe. They don't say this is what you should play. They don't tell young drummers who bemoan the fact that they have to practice paradiddles, you should be using paradiddles. You should be playing paradiddles. Instead, they are describing a very common way to play a drum. It is normal, it is usual, it is practical, and it is common to combine single strokes and double strokes when playing a pattern. If there was no use for these, we would have defaulted to playing single strokes for everything hundreds of years ago. We have hundreds of years of development on the snare drum where these have been tried, tested, developed, and if they don't work, if they don't serve a purpose, abandoned. But the paradiddles haven't. Measured rolls haven't. Flams, drags, ruffs, flammacues, pataflaflas, flammed mills, they've all been kept around because they are functional and they are commonly employed, commonly used, commonly found in the repertoire, commonly found on beatings because they serve some rhythmic function, they serve some technical function, they serve some practical function. They might be easily recognizable, especially loud, especially rhythmically interesting, who knows, but they serve some function that has meant they've been kept around. But each of these ideas are expanded into much broader concepts. I won't go into it now because it gets quite difficult to differentiate it from paradiddles. But the measured roll concept, if we can have a 17-stroke roll, why can't we have a 23-stroke roll? It doesn't exist on the list. That list has to stop somewhere. The 40 standard rudiments has to draw a line somewhere. Well, where do we draw that line? A 19-stroke roll, a 21-stroke roll, or a 43-stroke roll? Well, if we understand what a 19-stroke roll is, we can in theory understand quite easily what a 43-stroke roll is. We're just extending it. We're just making it longer. So these are just part of bigger ideas that describe how we're playing the drums. So in this sense, everything we play on the drums is rudimental. Not because we are intending to use rudimental patterns, not because we are playing something that was composed in a certain way, but because the word rudimental simply describes how we play the drums. That's it. That's what it is. It is a description of the act of playing the drums because everything that is bound up within that term rudimental, even if we limit ourselves to just the 40 standard rudiments, represents every way that it is conceivably possible to play a drum. If we have single strokes, which is either individual strokes per hand or even just a sustained stroke on one hand, right? Da, 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 with just the one hand. We have double strokes, which are 2 on a hand. We have triple strokes, which are 3 on a hand. We have buzz strokes. We have flams and drags in the acciaccatura, the ornamentation And then we have all the various combinations like ratamacus and flamacus, which just can combine these ideas in certain ways. Before we know it, we've covered every way that it's possible to strike a drum. Now, we can think about this really practically, and we can sit there with a drum in front of us and a drumstick in hand and try and come up with a way to play a drum that is not covered by the rudimental ideas. And we can't. We can buzz a stick, which is a buzz stroke, or we can let the stick hit once, which is just a single stroke. We can play 2 times on a hand, we can play 3 times on a hand, or we can play 9 times on a hand. But it's all just describing the same thing. We're all just rehashing these traditional ideas in novel ways, right? So if I play a 9-stroke roll, by which I mean a 9-stroke on one hand and 9-stroke on the other, it's just an expansion of concept. If I understand what a triple stroke roll is, then playing 9 on a hand instead of 3 is just an arbitrary modification of that. We already have that accounted for in the rudimental categorization. So this is the point that I keep returning to. This second definition is kind of so far-reaching that it encompasses the entirety of playing the drums full stop, as I've already said. So what does it mean then, with these definitions in hand, to point to one composer and say they are rudimental, and to point to another composer and say they are not rudimental? Is that possible? Is that meaningful? Or is that a meaningless distinction? Well, this is where the lines get blurry, and we have to be careful in how we use the terminology, because we can point to John Pratt, whether him, the composer, or the music that he wrote, a John Pratt piece, and we can say categorically, yes, it is rudimental. He was part of the rudimental movement. He founded the International Association of Rudimental Drummers to preserve traditional rudimental heritage. He used the word himself. He described himself as a rudimental drummer. And he wrote in the rudimental style. So this harks back to the first definition that I mentioned, where there is a distinct style, there is a distinct tradition and history and culture of uniquely rudimental playing. This is why rudimental pieces under this first definition have such a characteristic sound. They are based in traditional military functions, they have traditional forms, they have traditional combinations. One of the common ones is the paradiddle into a flamacu, which has a really characteristic accent syncopation. The marching style, they are identifiable in how they sound. So what does this mean then if we look to a composer like Delacluse? Now, very few people today would argue that Delacluse is a rudimental composer. He is known for his orchestral works. He played in an orchestra and he wrote orchestral pieces. He is described as such, and he is self-described as such. However, that doesn't exclude him from having his work analysed in rudimental ways. The very first beat of the first piece, Etude 1 in his Deux Etudes, is either, I can't remember now, it's either a flam or a rough. I can't remember which one it is, but it is something that you would find quite comfortably on a rudimental list. It's either a rough or it's either a 4-stroke rough or it's a drag. And in either case, it's on the list. You find buzz rolls, which are on the list. These are known, categorized descriptions and catered for by this second definition of rudimental drumming, which describes the entire plethora of ways in which we were able to play a drum, right? So from an analytical point of view, we can point to all of Delacluse's playing and analyze it in rudimental terms. However, this brings us on to a new point here, which is where it gets rather compositional in nature. Delacluse famously does not include sticking on his pieces. And this is relatively common for what we might consider the non-rudimental composers. This is common in Anthony Cirone's Portraits in Rhythm. And it becomes really interesting when we ask the question, why? Why is there no sticking on Delacluse's work? Why is there no sticking in Cirone's Portraits in Rhythm, to give 2 particular examples? And this is where the idea of rudimental playing as a compositional device comes into play. Because the idea of rudimental playing that kind of leans to the first definition as a distinct musical style is primarily concerned with the choice, the use, and the function of the vocabulary. So a rudimental composer is using paradiddle-based sticking, whether it is just a paradiddle or whether it is the much broader paradiddle concept, intentionally. That paradiddle sticking serves a certain function rhythmically. It serves a certain function for the performer. It serves a certain function for the use of right hands and left hands. So a rudimental composer who has chosen intentionally to work within a certain passage using the paradiddle concept writes in the sticking to make it very clear. This is based on paradiddles, and you, the performer, need to recognize that and perform it accordingly. Conversely, a composer like Delacluse is not interested in the formulation of phrases through the vocabulary and techniques used to perform them. Delacluse is predominantly interested in the rhythmic theme. So it's kind of a reversal of priority. Delacluse does not care how you perform the phrase. He cares about how you perform the phrase in terms of its musical and rhythmic expression. Whether you use single strokes, paradiddles, or all just on one hand, I really don't think he would care in the slightest. What he cares about is that you are expressing the rhythmic idea. So one of the key reasons why we wouldn't describe Delacluse today as being rudimental is because of his intention and his compositional devices. When I sit down to compose, I have to make a distinct choice. What am I basing this piece on, and what approach am I using to compose it? Now, if I'm sitting down and intending to compose a rudimental piece, then I start considering the use of vocabulary. I start considering how the rudimental building blocks, be they discrete or be they the much broader concept, can be used to build phrases. So to give you a very, very simple and watered down example, if I take the paradiddle concept and I say, okay, I'm in 4/4, and I'm going to combine two paradiddles, a paradiddle, a paradiddle-diddle, and a triple paradiddle, and each of those patterns has got the characteristic accent at the beginning, what phrase does that create? It's a sort of exploration. What happens if I combine paradiddles in this way? Alternatively, I might be faced with a passage where I've already written the notes, the accents are already placed, and I can ponder how best to write the sticking. Do I want to stick this as paradiddles? Do I want to have that passage there as single strokes? How does that feel to lead from a paradiddle into a single stroke and then back into the paradiddles again? Is that fluid? Does that feel good to the performer? These are rudimental considerations because my main priority is in the techniques and vocabulary used to actually perform it. For Delacluse, the idea is how does that rhythmic theme continue from the previous rhythmic theme? How does that reprise the theme I started earlier on in the piece? How it's performed and how it's composed have nothing to do with the strokes and the techniques and the vocabulary in the rudimental sense. So as I say, the boundaries get quite blurred depending on where we are talking, because we can look at any piece of drumming music, any composer, any tradition from any period in history, and we can analyze it rudimentally. But this becomes much more difficult with someone like Delacluse where there is no sticking, because there is nothing to stop us just shrugging and playing the whole thing as single strokes, and that would be perfectly valid if we are expressing the rhythms as Delacluse intended in a way that we have interpreted as being musical. However, the mere moment, the very moment that we decide to play the whole thing as single strokes, we have made a rudimental choice. We have chosen a sticking concept. Remember, there is nothing default about single strokes, right? You give a 3-year-old a pair of drumsticks and ask 10 of them to play a drum, 3 of them will use single strokes, 2 of them will use double strokes, and the rest will just hit it with one hand and forget they're holding a stick in the other hand. There is nothing fundamental about single strokes. To some people, playing 2 on a hand is more comfortable. To some people, playing the whole thing single-handed is the intuitive thing to do, and playing one stroke after another in a single stroke roll is a little bit weird. So the moment we make that choice, I'm going to play this whole Delacluse piece as single strokes, we have made a rudimental decision, whether we intended to or not. Because remember, under this second definition that I'm presenting, the term rudimental is a very far-reaching, comprehensive description of the very ways in which it is possible to play a drum. So, where does this leave us? Well, we can, I think, allow both of these definitions to exist and coexist quite peacefully. In a very conventional sense, we can use the first definition and describe rudimental drumming as being a sort of genre. We can point to rudimental composers who are concerned with the use of vocabulary and techniques as part of their compositional approach. We can point to the traditions of the various countries that contributed to the development of rudimental drumming, the characteristic named techniques, the characteristic pieces that contribute to the repertoire, the characteristic style that is often based on a march, especially in the traditional sense. And we can allow this to exist as a style of music in the same way we might with the blues. But we can also allow for the rudimental concept to be much broader. We can allow for the rudimental concept to be descriptive of all of the different ways that we can actually play a drum. And this is something that I have really had a lot of fun, I think. I found really interesting writing about this and collecting all of my thoughts in this current book, as I've suggested. So I often talk to new students who are, I think, a little bit confused or apprehensive about the prospect of the rudiments. Do I need to practice the rudiments? This is a common question. Should I practice the rudiments to be a better drummer? Well, in one sense, you already are. Because the very moment you pick up a pair of sticks and hit a drum, you are doing something that is covered by the broad rudimental umbrella. Even if you're playing one-handed, we can as a certain single-handed roll or just single strokes on one hand. However you choose to hit the drum, you are doing something that rudimental drumming as an analysis, as a concept, can describe. Because in this sense, as I've said, rudimental drumming is just synonymous with the concept of hitting a drum at all. But we can also say the rudiments exist as this sort of categorized idea. There are named techniques, traditions and histories and all the rest of it. So the question is therefore, do I want to be a rudimental drummer in this sense? Do you need to practice the rudiments? Well, if I put my teacher hat on for a moment, I would of course say yes. I think everybody would benefit from practicing the rudiments in the first definition. Learning the traditional techniques, learning the development and the history of where they came from, learning the traditional repertoire can be incredibly beneficial for your technique as well as your broader musical understanding, as well as it being the very history of the instrument you profess to practice. But that doesn't mean you are committing yourself to a life of sepia photographs, right? You're not committing yourself to being an old-timey, archaic drummer that's only interested in marches. You're just learning your instrument a little bit more deeply. So there's a lot to be said here, I think, for taking the rudiments to be a much more conceptual approach to the drums. Should I practice the rudiments? Well, yes, because you already are doing. You need to practice playing 1 stroke per hand, 2 strokes per hand, possibly 3 strokes per hand. You need to practice combining those. You need to practice buzzing the stick. You need to practice your drags and flams because these are ways we produce interesting sounds. Once you get into this, if you start practicing the various combinations, I've already mentioned a paradiddle into a flamacue, well, you're well on the road to the rudimental conceptual and compositional standpoint already. Because the whole idea of framing a paradiddle next to a flamacue is because of the specific accent pattern it creates, the syncopation. So where do we draw the line? If we allow a paradiddle to be a discrete pattern and a flamacue to be a discrete pattern, you can practice those if you want to learn a particular pattern. But if you start combining the two and you think, actually, I really like the phrase that creates, maybe I can turn that into a fill. Well, I'm sorry to tell you, you're a rudimental drummer because these are rudimental concepts, whether you are intending to use them in that way or not. So I think I'm going to have to leave it there because I'm running out of ways to rehash the same statement. I think I'm repeating myself a little bit, but I think it's a fascinating discussion. And it was really brought about by something Rick Dior said to me. He's been good enough to write a foreword for my book here. And part of the book is a collection of, 12 or 14 rudimental pieces that I've composed, both as a genuine contribution to the repertoire, but also as an opportunity for the reader to practice the concepts the book talks about. And in his foreword, Rick made a comment along the lines of, the pieces may not be recognizable as rudimental to the traditional rudimental drummers. So what he is saying is somebody like Will Coxon or Pratt might not look at my piece and recognize it instantly as a traditional rudimental piece. And he would probably be quite right, because this is playing on that division between the first definition and the second definition. Now, some of the pieces in the collection are very traditional and they were written in the traditional style. Some of the pieces, they play with the idea of rudiment as concept. They play with the idea of rudiment as descriptive of different compositional techniques and different ways to produce stickings or different ways to use stickings or write stickings. So they are certainly rudimental in the conceptual approach, even if they deviate from the traditional rudimental as style of music standpoint. And this is really what motivated this discussion here today. As I said at the very beginning, I'm not convinced I have a dedicated answer here, but I do think it is beneficial to see the rudiments in this dualistic sense. So I think to close and to summarize, as I've said, we can think of the rudiments as a discrete style of music with the history and the traditions and the set repertoire, but we can also think of the rudiments much more conceptually and how that applies and how that relates to playing the drum on a much more general level. So I hope this has been of some interest to you. I would very much like to hear your thoughts. If you've got any comments or questions or suggestions, please get in touch at jonathancurtis.co.uk, where you will find everything about me. All of my publications, my compositions, lessons for those of you that might like to consider tuition. And I'm available on YouTube as well. I've got a host of videos at J Curtis Drums. And I'm thinking at some point in the future, I might do one of these podcast episodes as a Q&A session. So if you have any particular questions you would like to submit to that, please send them through. You can find me on Reddit at jcurtisdrums, through my website, jonathancurtis.co.uk, comment on one of my videos, YouTube/jcurtisdrums. However you want to get it to me, you can email me directly. Send your questions in and I will try to address them in a dedicated Q&A episode at some point in the future. But that's it for now. The Snare Drum Virtuoso, the book after which this podcast is named, is available worldwide. It's a massive collection of really rather difficult technical studies for the snare drum. And the Rudimental Drummer is forthcoming. Stay tuned. Thank you very much for now, and I'll see you on the next episode.